Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
Now, Dr. Kevin Dutton is my producer's favourite guest in all the world. She talks so highly of him, I can hardly wait to hear from him. He's a psychologist at Cambridge University and is well qualified all round to help us through exactly what might have been going through the mind of this mass murderer. Dr. Dutton, thanks very much indeed for coming on the show.
Good evening, George. How are you, mate?
I'm well, sir. You've got a lot of fans around TalkSport, I must say. So let's hear your point of view on what the mental issues at play here might be.
Well, there are no easy answers to what happened on Utoya Island last week, George, but the two questions that many people are asking at the moment are these. Do spree killers have a telltale psychological profile, and does Anders Breivik conform to it? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. Let's start with the basics. The first thing to bear in mind here, George, and it's a fundamental point, is this. Rarely has there been a spree killer in history who was the life and soul of the party. Rarely has there been a spree killer in history of which people said, you know what, I couldn't get enough of that guy. Time just flew by when I was talking to him. No, instead, what you get, as we're beginning to get with Breivik now, is the quiet, mild-mannered, retiring kind of guy who's sometimes a little bit touchy. At least that is in Breivik's case, before the political and religious extremism kicked in. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, there's a reason why you get this kind of profile, George. It's the profile of someone with a hugely inflated ego, but who nevertheless still feels socially inadequate. Now, listen to this. The day after the carnage, an old friend of Breivik's turned up in a television studio in Stockholm, and he said he was surprised by all the Knights of the Templar stuff and the 1,500-page manifesto and what have you, because Breivik had never really been all that religious, had never been political either. But the bloke said the one thing that really brassed him off was when certain girls he liked passed him over for guys of Asian origin. Well, no more calls, George. I think we got a winner here, mate. Here, I think, buried deep beneath the rubble of all the socio-political rhetoric we've been hearing, we finally make contact with the pathetic, unremarkable nub of the problem, which is this. There is usually a defining moment in spree killers' lives. But you know what? You don't have to look hard for it, mate, for the simple reason that it's usually something completely innocuous on the outside, but to the person themselves, something excruciatingly painful, and because of that pain, something deeply significant. What happened on Utoya Island, George, wasn't about immigration, I don't think, or it wasn't about the Eurocrats' plot against the people. In fact, it wasn't really about ideology or religion at all. That's just the window dressing. Make no mistake, I think it was all about him, Breivik, and his deep-seated feelings of inadequacy when it came to women. Now, here's the key point. One of the things we know about narcissists and egomaniacs, George, is that they have a tendency to externalise blame. They've got a real natural talent for it, mate. Nothing is their fault. It's always somebody else's. Enter stage left ideology. in capital letters. And here, incidentally, George, there's all this talk about Breivik's Christian leanings and all that. I think parallels can be drawn with some of the acts committed by young Muslim terrorists. The fundamental reasons for what these young guys do, just like for what Breivik did, lie deep in their own personal sense of rejection and alienation, not in ideology. Sure, it's the ideology that gives them the cause, but I think the naked, unglamorous origins of their actions are predominantly rooted in private, individual disillusionment, and that is precisely what charismatic radicalizers are on the lookout for and what they exploit. The world over, mate, their stock in trade is continually to press the links between the personal grievances of the people they recruit and the bigger, wider picture. Until, in the end, George, what inevitably happens, mate, is this. These recruits conveniently forget why they had an axe to grind in the first place, and they come instead to embrace the surrogate cause, to genuinely believe that they really are working for the, as they now see it, the greater good of the brotherhood.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, February 23rd, 2018. So I have been told this is our sixth and final study session on Mr. Kevin Dutton's The Wisdom of Psychopaths. We will be all done today, wrapping up the seventh and final chapter. That was actually Kevin Dutton. The audio snippet that you heard at the beginning of the program, he was talking about Anders Breivik, convicted murderer, mass murderer. He orchestrated the 2011 purge in Norway. I think he killed more than 60 people. There was a bomb. He had several explosives, I think, that were detonated, and then he went out and gunned down dozens of white people, had his huge manifesto talking about how he was upset about Islamophobia and non-white people coming into his part of the world. But I thought what Mr. Dutton was saying there, very applicable to the white collective on the whole, particularly when you incorporate Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's theory of white genetic annihilation, that deep-rooted sense of inferiority, that there's something personally defective about them, that lack of melanin, and then the aggression that is prompted from that sense of inferiority. I think it matches. I think you see a lot of that not only with Anders Breivik, but whites collectively, historically, globally, males, females, the whole gambit. This is a short section. We don't even have an hour of audio. So if you have final comments, concluding thoughts that you want to share about the text, what we've heard, what we're going to hear today, don't dally because we don't have a lot of audio. So without further ado, this is the final segment on Kevin Dutton's The Wisdom of Psychopaths, Context of White Supremacy.
Heroes and Villains. Mem Mahmood at Macquarie University in Sydney has turned up something extraordinary. Psychopaths, it appears, far from being callous and unemotional all the time, can actually, in the right kind of context, be more altruistic than the rest of us. Mahmood conducted a study comprising a series of real-life scenarios in which people asked for help from passers-by, unsuspecting volunteers who'd previously been tested for psychopathy and classified as high or low scorers. But there was a catch. The people asking for help, just like the passers-by who responded to them, weren't exactly random. They were, in fact, Mahmoud's evil co-conspirators in a unique, fiendishly constructed experiment specifically designed to investigate the relationship between psychopathy and helping behavior. The experiment consisted of 3 parts. In the first part, Mahmoud's accomplices solicited help directly from the passers-by by pretending to be lost and approaching to ask for directions. In the second part, the request for help was much less direct and explicit, a hapless female who dropped a bunch of papers. In the third part, the request was less explicit still. A lab researcher who'd supposedly broken her arm pretending to have difficulty with a variety of simple tasks. opening a water bottle and entering the participant's name in a fake logbook, for instance, but bravely persevering in spite of her conspicuous injury. Who in these three different scenarios, Mahmoud wanted to know, would be most likely to offer help? The remorseless, cold-hearted psychopaths, or their warmer, more empathic counterparts? The result of the study blew Mahmoud away. In fact, so far off beam were they that he's still trying to get his head around them. In the first part, in which the accomplice asked for directions, the psychopaths, as predicted, offered less help than the non-psychopaths. No surprises there. In the second part, however, dropped papers, the altruism gap mysteriously disappeared. The psychopaths and the non-psychopaths offered an equal amount of help. But it was in the third part, in which the accomplice feigned an injury, that the wheels really came off Mahmoud's preconceived hypothesis that the psychopaths would be less obliging. In fact, the opposite turned out to be true. The psychopaths showed a greater readiness to put themselves forward for water bottle duty and to enter their own names into the logbook than the non-psychopaths. When the person asking for help was at their most vulnerable and yet at the same time didn't endeavor to proactively solicit aid, the psychopaths came up with the goods. When it really mattered, they were significantly more likely to step up to the plate than were their, supposedly at least, warmer, more empathic counterparts. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the results of Mahmoud's experiment have certainly raised some eyebrows. One interpretation, of course, is that, as some enlightened and no doubt rather embittered soul once pointed out, there is no such thing as a truly altruistic act. There is always, however, well camouflaged in the darker recesses of our dense psychological undergrowth, an ulterior, self-serving, distinctly less honorable motive. And the psychopaths in Mahmoud's study, with their finely tuned, highly sensitive long-range vulnerability antennae, recall the experiment conducted by Angela Book, in which psychopaths were better able than non-psychopaths to pick out the victims of a violent assault merely from the way they walked, quite simply smelled blood. "It is pleasure that lurks in the practice of every one of your virtues," wrote the novelist W. Somerset Maugham in Of Human Bondage. "Man performs actions because they are good for him, and when they are good for other people as well, they are thought virtuous. It is for your private pleasure that you give 2d to a beggar as much as it is for my private pleasure that I drink another whiskey and soda. I, less of a humbug than you, neither applaud myself for my pleasure nor demand your admiration." On the other hand, however, there is evidence to suggest that Mahmoud's incendiary findings are no flash in the pan, and they mark the beginnings of a welcome new shift in both empirical and theoretical focus, away from the conventionally pejorative physiological profiles cranked out by the neuroimaging brigade toward a more applied, pragmatic research drive into functional, positive psychopathy. As a case in point, Diana Falkenbach and Maria Tsoukalis at the John Jay College for Criminal Justice, City University of New York, have recently been studying the incidence of so-called adaptive psychopathic characteristics in what they term hero populations, in front-line professions such as law enforcement, the military, and the rescue services, for example. What they've discovered gels nicely with the data that Mahmoud's research has uncovered. On the one hand, though exemplifying a pro-social lifestyle, hero populations are tough. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the level of trauma and risk such occupations entail, they show a greater preponderance of psychopathic traits associated with the fearless/dominance and cold-heartedness subscales of the PPI, e.g. low anxiety, social dominance, and stress immunity, compared with the general population at large. These dials are turned up higher. On the other hand, however, they part company with criminal psychopaths in their relative absence of traits related to the self-centered impulsivity subscale, e.g. Machiavellianism, narcissism, carefree non-planfulness, and antisocial behavior. These dials are turned down lower. Such a profile is consistent with the anatomy of the hero as portrayed by the psychologist Philip Zimbardo, founder of the Heroic Imagination Project, an initiative aimed at educating folk in the insidious techniques of social influence, or more specifically, how to resist them. In 1971, in an experiment that has long since been inaugurated into psychology's Hall of Fame, Zimbardo constructed a simulated prison in the basement of Stanford University's psychology building and randomly assigned 12 student volunteers to play the role of prisoner, while another 12 were to play the role of guard. After just 6 days, the study was abandoned. A number of the guards had begun to abuse the prisoners, misusing their power simply because they had it. 40 years on, post-Abu Ghraib and the painful lessons learned, Zimbardo is engaged in a radically different project to develop the hero muscle within all of us. Having uncorked the genie of the villain and the victim within, he now seeks to do the opposite, to empower everyday folk to stand up and make a difference when they might otherwise be silenced by fear. And not just when it comes to physical confrontations, but psychological confrontations too, which, depending on the circumstances, can pose just as much of a challenge. The decision to act heroically is a choice that many of us will be called upon to make at some point in our lives, Zimbardo tells me. It means not being afraid of what others might think. It means not being afraid of the fallout for ourselves. It means not being afraid of putting our necks on the line. The question is, are we going to take that decision? Over coffee in his office, we talk about fear, conformity, and the ethical imperative of braving psychological as well as physical confrontation. Not unexpectedly, our old friend groupthink rears its head again, which occurs, as we saw in Chapter 3 with the Challenger disaster, when the warped, in-group forces of social gravitation exert such pressures on a collective as to precipitate, in the words of Irving Janis, the psychologist who carried out much of the early work on the process, a deterioration in mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment. Zimbardo cites, as another case in point, the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces during the Second World War. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack against a United States naval base on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The offensive was intended as a preemptive strike, aimed at precluding the U.S. Pacific Fleet from compromising planned Japanese incursions against the Allies in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. It proved devastating. A total of 188 U.S. aircraft were destroyed. 2,402 Americans were killed and 1,282 injured, prompting then-President Franklin D. Roosevelt to call the following day for a formal declaration of war on the Empire of Japan. Congress gave him the go-ahead. It took them less than an hour. But might the attack on Pearl Harbor have been prevented? The catastrophic carnage and chaotic combative consequences averted? There's evidence to suggest that it could, and that a constellation of groupthink factors, false assumptions, unchecked consensus, unchallenged reasoning biases, illusions of invulnerability, all contributed to a singular lack of precaution taken by U.S. Navy officers stationed in Hawaii. In intercepting Japanese communications, for example, the United States had reliable information that Japan was in the process of gearing itself up for an offensive. Washington took action by relaying this intelligence to the military high command at Pearl Harbor. Yet the warnings were casually ignored. The developments were dismissed as saber-rattling. Japan was merely taking measures to forestall the annexation of their embassies in enemy territories. Rationalizations included, the Japanese would never dare attempt a full-scale surprise assault against Hawaii because they would realize that it would precipitate an all-out war, which the United States would surely win. And even if the Japanese were foolhardy enough to send their carriers to attack us, the United States, we could certainly detect and destroy them in plenty of time. History attests they were wrong. as an example of the expediency of psychological troubleshooting and of the spiritual qualities of fearlessness and mental toughness inherent in heroic action, both the Challenger and Pearl Harbor fiascos provide intriguing parallels between the work of Philip Zimbardo and that of Diana Falkenbach and Maria Tsoukalos mentioned earlier. Previously, we explored the possibility that psychopathic characteristics such as charm, low anxiety, and stress immunity, the characteristics that Falkenbach and Tsoukalos identified in comparatively greater number in hero populations, may well, somewhat ironically, have managed to gain a toehold in our evolutionary gene pool through their propensity to facilitate conflict resolution. Dominant individuals among chimpanzees, stump-tailed monkeys, and gorillas all compete for mates, if you recall, by intervening in disputes among subordinates. Yet an alternative explanation, and the two, of course, are far from mutually exclusive, is that such characteristics may also have evolved and withstood the test of time for precisely the opposite reason, for their catalytic capacity to actually instigate conflict. Such a position would better align itself with a more orthodox reading of the evolution of psychopathy. Traditionally, the Darwinian account of psychopathy has rested predominantly on the nonconformist aspect of the disorder, Criterion 1, if you recall from Chapter 2, for antisocial personality disorder reads, failure to conform to social norms, on the psychopath's devil-may-care attitude towards social conventions. Conventions, on the one hand, such as honesty, accountability, responsibility, and monogamy. Yet, on the other hand, also conventions like social compliance, which, deep in our ancestral past, would undoubtedly have contributed to perilously poor decision-making, and thereby, in those turbulent, treacherous times, to a grisly, carnivorous death. It's the principle of David and Goliath, the little guy with a slingshot lodging his cool, dissenting pebble in the cogs of the all-conquering machine, immune to the pressures of a toxic insider empathy, the lone voice in the wilderness. Jack the Stripper. Researchers and clinicians often argue that psychopaths don't do empathy, that because of their lethargic amygdala, they just don't feel things in the same way as the rest of us. Studies have revealed that when psychopaths are shown distressing images of, say, famine victims, the lights located in the emotion corridors of their brains quite simply don't come on, that their brains, if viewed under fMRI conditions, merely pull down the emotional window blinds and implement a neural curfew. Sometimes, as we've seen, such curfews can have their advantages, as in the medical profession, for instance. But sometimes the curtains can shut out the light completely, and the darkness can be truly impenetrable. In the summer of 2010, I jumped on a plane to Quantico, Virginia, to interview Supervisory Special Agent James Beasley III at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Beasley is one of America's foremost authorities on psychopaths and serial murder, and has profiled criminals right across the board, from child abductors to rapists, from drug barons to spree killers. During his 27 years as a federal employee, the last 17 of which he spent at the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, there's not much Special Agent Beasley hasn't heard, seen, or dealt with. But several years ago, he interviewed a guy who was so far down the temperature scale he almost cracked the thermometer. There was a string of armed robberies, Beasley explains, and whoever was behind them wasn't too worried about pulling the trigger. Usually, when you deal with armed robbers, the person committing them will just use the gun as a threat. But this guy was different, and it was always at close range, a single shot to the head. I was in no doubt whatsoever that we had a psychopath on our hands. The guy was as cold as ice, mesmerizingly ruthless. But there was something about him that just didn't quite add up, something about him that bothered me. After one of the killings, which, as it happened, turned out to be his last, we caught up with him shortly after that, he'd taken his victim's jacket. Now that just didn't make sense. Normally, when someone removes an article of clothing from a murder scene, it means one of two things. There's either some kind of sexual stuff going on, or there's some other kind of fantasy world being spun out. It's known in the trade as a trophy killing. But neither of those two scenarios fitted this guy's profile. He was too, functional. All business, if you know what I mean. So when we brought him in, we asked him, what was the deal with the guy's jacket? And you know what he said? He said, it was a spur-of-the-moment thing. As I was making my way out the door, I looked at the dude as he lay there slumped over the counter. And I suddenly thought to myself, that jacket kind of goes with my shirt. So what the hell, I thought. The guy's already dead. He's not going anywhere. So I took it. Wore it out to a bar that night, as it happens. Got laid, in fact. You could say it's my lucky jacket. Unlucky for him, but lucky for me. When you hear stories like this, it's hard to believe that psychopaths have even heard of empathy, let alone experienced it. Yet surprisingly, the picture is far from clear in this regard. Mem Mahmood, for instance, showed us that under some sets of circumstances, psychopaths in fact seem to be more empathic than the rest of us, or more helpful at any rate. Then, if you recall, there was the study by Shirley Fecteau and her colleagues, which showed that psychopaths appear to have more going on in their mirror neuron systems, particularly the neurons in the somatosensory areas of their brains, the ones that allow us to identify with others when they're in physical pain, than non-psychopaths. Whether it's the case that some psychopaths have more empathy than others, or that some are better able to switch it on and off than others, or that some psychopaths are simply better at faking it than others, is at present unknown. But it's a fascinating question, one that cuts right to the heart of the psychopath's true identity, and one, no doubt, that will be hotly debated for years. On precisely this issue, I asked Beasley about serial killers. How, in his experience, do they measure up on the empathy scale? I'm pretty confident I already know the answer. But Beasley, it turns out, has a surprise in store for me. You know, this idea that serial killers lack empathy is a little bit misleading, he says. Sure, you get your Henry Lee Lucas kind of killer who says that killing a person is just like squashing a bug. And for this functional, instrumental species of serial murderer, perennial drifters who are just after a quick buck, a lack of empathy may well be beneficial, may well contribute to their elusiveness. Dead men tell no tales, right? But for another category of serial killer, those we call sadistic serial killers, for whom murder is an end in itself, the presence of empathy, enhanced empathy even, serves two important purposes. Take Ted Bundy, for instance. Bundy ensnared his victims, all of whom were female college students, by pretending to be disabled in some way or other. Arm in a sling, crutches, that kind of thing. Bundy knew, rationally at least, which buttons to press in order to get their assistance, in order to gain their trust. Now, if he hadn't known that, if he hadn't been able to put himself in their shoes, would he really have been able to dupe them so effectively? The answer, I believe, is no. A certain degree of cognitive empathy, a modicum of theory of mind, is an essential requirement for the sadistic serial killer. On the other hand, however, there has to be a degree of emotional empathy, too. Otherwise, how would you derive any enjoyment from watching your victims suffer, from beating them and torturing them and so on? The answer, quite simply, is you wouldn't. So the bottom line, strange though it may seem, is this. Sadistic serial killers feel their victims' pain in exactly the same way that you or I might feel it. They feel it cognitively and objectively, and they feel it emotionally and subjectively too. But the difference between them and us is that they commute that pain to their own subjective pleasure. In fact, it would probably be true to say that the greater the amount of empathy they have, the greater the amount of pleasure that they get, which, when you think about it, is kind of weird. It most certainly is. But as I sit listening to Beasley, I begin to make connections. Suddenly, things start to make sense. Philip Morant, one of the world's most ruthless con men and a certified bona fide psychopath, he simply oozed empathy. That was what made him so good, so mercilessly adept at pinpointing and zoning in on his victims' psychological pressure points. In the mirror neuron study conducted by Shirley Fecteau, psychopaths showed greater empathy than non-psychopaths. The video she showed depicted a scene of physical pain, a needle going into a hand. And then, of course, there was Mem Mahmoud's helping experiment. The fact that the psychopaths managed to out-empathize the non-psychopaths when it came to the broken arm condition might have raised his eyebrows, perhaps, but certainly not James Beasley's. Exactly as I'd have predicted, he comments without hesitation. Though I guess, he pauses briefly as he weighs up the options. Though I guess it kind of depends on which type of psychopath he was testing. Beasley tells me about a study conducted by Alfred Heilbrunn, a psychologist at Emory University back in the 1980s. Heilbrunn analyzed the personality structures of more than 150 criminals. On the basis of that analysis, he differentiated between two very different types of psychopaths. Those who had poor impulse control, low IQ, and little empathy, the Henry Lee Lucas type, and those who had better impulse control, high IQ, a sadistic motivation, and heightened empathy, the Ted Bundy, or, if you like, Hannibal Lecter type. But the data concealed a spine-chilling twist. The group that, in fact, exhibited the most empathy of all, according to Heilbrunn's taxonomy, comprised high IQ psychopaths with a history of extreme violence, and in particular, rape, an act that occasionally incorporates a vicarious sadistic component. Not only are violent acts that inflict pain and suffering on others often more intentional than impulsive, Heilbrunn pointed out, echoing Beasley's earlier observation. It is, in addition, precisely through the presence of empathy and the perpetrator's awareness of the pain being experienced by his victim that preliminary arousal and the subsequent satisfaction of sadistic objectives are achieved. Not all psychopaths, it would seem, are colorblind. Some see the stop sign in exactly the same way as the rest of us. It's just that they choose to run the light. The mask behind the face. The fact that a proportion of psychopaths, at least, would appear to experience empathy, and perhaps experience it to a greater degree than the rest of us, may well go some way to clearing up a mystery. How the psychopaths in Angela Book's vulnerability study managed to pick up those cues in deportment, those telltale signs in the gait of traumatized assault victims, better than the rest of us. But if you think psychopaths are alone in their ability to detect splinters of deep emotion invisible to the naked eye, shards of unprocessed feeling buried way beneath the seam of conscious censorship, then you're wrong. Paul Ekman at the University of California, Berkeley, reports that 2 Tibetan monks expert in meditation have outperformed judges, policemen, psychiatrists, customs officials, and even Secret Service agents on a subliminal face processing task that had, up until the monks entered the lab, managed to stump everyone who'd had a go at it, and there were more than 5,000 of them. The task comprises 2 parts. First, images of faces displaying one of the 6 basic emotions: anger, sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, and surprise, are flashed on a computer screen. The faces appear for sufficient duration to enable the brain to process them, but insufficient duration for volunteers to be able to consciously report what they see. In the second part of the task, volunteers are required to pick out the face that previously flashed on the screen from a subsequently presented identity parade of 6. Typically, performance is at chance level. Over a series of trials, volunteers average a hit rate of around 1 in 6. But the monks averaged 3 or 4. Their secret, Ekman speculates, may hinge on an enhanced, almost preternatural ability to read micro-expressions. Those minuscule, millisecond stroboscopic frames of emotion we learned about earlier that begin to download on the muscles across our faces before our conscious brain has time to hit the delete button and display instead the image we wish to present. If so, They'll share that ability with psychopaths. Sabrina Dmitriev at the University of British Columbia has recently found precisely such abilities in individuals scoring high on the Hare self-report scale of psychopathy, especially with regard to expressions of fear and sadness. Even more intriguing is what happened when Ekman brought one of the monks he'd tested down to the Berkeley Psychophysiology Laboratory, run by his colleague Robert Levinson, to assess his presence of mind. Here, after being wired up to equipment sensitive to even the minutest fluctuations in autonomic function, muscle contraction, pulse rate, perspiration, and skin temperature, the monk was told that at some point during the ensuing 5-minute period, he would be subjected to the sound of a sudden, loud explosion, the equivalent, Ekman and Levinson decided under the circumstances, of a gun being fired just centimeters away from the ear, the maximal threshold of human acoustical tolerance. Forewarned of the blast, the monk was instructed to attempt, to the best of his ability, to suppress the inevitable startle response to the extent of rendering it, if at all possible, completely imperceptible. Of course, Ekman and Levinson had been round far too many lab blocks to expect a miracle. Of the hundreds of subjects who had previously filed through the doors, not one of them had managed to flatline, not even elite police sharpshooters. To not respond at all was impossible. The monitors always picked up something. Or so they thought. But they had never tested a Tibetan master of meditation before, and much to their amazement, they had finally met their match. Seemingly against all laws of human physiology, the monk exhibited not the slightest reaction to the explosion. He didn't jump. He didn't flinch. He didn't do anything. He flatlined. The gun went off, and the monk just sat there like a statue. In all their years, Ekman and Levinson had never seen anything like it. When he tries to repress the startle, it almost disappears, Ekman observed afterward. We've never found anyone who can do that, nor have any other researchers. This is a spectacular accomplishment. We don't have any idea of the anatomy that would allow him to suppress the startle reflex. The monk himself, who at the moment of the blast had been practicing a technique known as open presence meditation, put a different slant on it. In that state, he explains, I was not actively trying to control the startle, but the detonation seemed weaker, as if I were hearing it from a distance. In the distracted state, the explosion suddenly brings you back to the present moment and causes you to jump out of surprise. But while in open presence, you are resting in the present moment, and the bang simply occurs and causes only a little disturbance, like a bird crossing the sky. I wonder if they tested his hearing. Roadkill. The work of Paul Ekman, Robert Levinson, and Richard Davidson, mentioned earlier, supports the general consensus that both the cultivation and maintenance of a relaxed state of mind can considerably aid not just our responses to, but also our perceptions of, the stressors of modern living. Few of us, of course, will ever attain the rarefied spiritual peaks of a Tibetan Buddhist monk, but nearly all of us, on the other hand, will have benefited from keeping a cool head at one time or another. Yet psychopaths, it would seem, are the exceptions to the rule. In fact, psychopaths, rather than engaging, as do Buddhist monks, in meditation to assimilate inner calm, appear, as their performance on the moral dilemma task demonstrated earlier, to instead have a natural talent for it. And it's not just their results on cognitive decision-making tasks that provide support for such a conclusion. Further evidence of this innate gift for cool comes from basic, low-level studies of emotional reactivity. In work reminiscent of the emotional interrupt study mentioned earlier, Chris Patrick of Florida State University compared the reactions of psychopaths and non-psychopaths as they viewed a series of horrific, nauseating, and pleasurable images, respectively. On all physiological measures, blood pressure, sweat production, heart rate, and blink rate, he found that the psychopaths exhibited significantly less arousal than did normal members of the population, or, to use the proper terminology, that they had an attenuated emotional startle response. The greatest worth, wrote the 11th century Buddhist teacher Atisha, is self-mastery. The greatest magic, transmuting the passions. And to some extent, it would seem, psychopaths have the jump on the rest of us. But this jump isn't always metaphorical in nature. The notion of the psychopath being one step ahead can sometimes be just as true in the literal sense of that phrase, as in when getting from point A to point B, as it is when it comes to our responses to emotional stimuli. And such perpetual peregrination can be just as ascetically demanding. The transient peripatetic lifestyle, a core feature of the psychopathic personality, has, just like the transmutation of the passions, ancient foundations in the lore of spiritual enlightenment. In Atisha's time, for example, the embodiment of the spiritual archetype was the shramana, or wandering monk, and the shamanic ideal of renunciation and abandonment, of loneliness, transience, and contemplation emulated the path to enlightenment followed by the Buddha himself. These days, of course, the shramana is spiritually extinct, a primordial ghost that haunts the star-swept crossroads of spectral, nirvanic wastelands. But in the neon-lit shadows of bars, motels, and casinos, the psychopath is still going strong, assuming, just like his monastic forebears, an itinerant, nomadic existence. Take serial murder, for example. The latest FBI crime figures estimate that there are around 35 to 50 serial killers operating at any one time within the United States. That's a hell of a lot of serial killers by anyone's standards. But dig a little deeper into why this might be the case, and you soon begin to wonder if it shouldn't, in fact, be more. The U.S. interstate highway system is a schizophrenic beast. During the daytime, its rest areas are busily frequented and have a convivial family vibe. But during the hours of darkness, the mood can quickly change. Many become the haunts of drug dealers and prostitutes on the lookout for easy pickings, long-haul truck drivers, and other itinerant workers. These women aren't exactly missed by their families back home. Many lie dead for weeks, sometimes years, at rest stops and vacant lots the length and breadth of America, often hundreds of miles away from where they were originally picked up. Police recently discovered the 5 to 10-year-old remains of one of the victims of the Long Island serial killer, for instance, who at the time of writing has been linked to a total of 10 murders over a 15-year period. The true number of lives claimed by Henry Lee Lucas will never be known. The vastness of the country, the paucity of witnesses, the fact that each state constitutes an independent legal jurisdiction, and the way both victims and offenders are frequently just passing through, all adds up to a logistical, statistical nightmare for the investigating authorities concerned. I ask one FBI special agent whether he thinks that psychopaths are specially suited to certain types of professions. He shakes his head. Well, they definitely make good truckers, he chuckles. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that a truck probably constitutes the most important piece of equipment in the serial killer's toolkit here in the U.S. It's a modus operandi and getaway vehicle rolled into one. The agent in question is part of a team of law enforcement officers currently working on the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative, a scheme designed to both facilitate the flow of data within America's complex mosaic of autonomous legal jurisdictions and to increase public awareness of the murders. The initiative started almost by accident. In 2004, an analyst from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation detected a pattern. The bodies of murdered women had begun turning up at regular intervals along the Interstate 40 corridor running through Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Analysts working on the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, a national matrix containing information on homicides, sexual assaults, missing persons, and unidentified human remains, scanned their database to see if similar patterns of highway killings existed elsewhere. They did, and then some. So far, ongoing investigations have revealed more than 500 murder victims from along or near highways, as well as a list of some 200 potential suspects. Psychopaths are shadowmancers, the agent tells me, a large-scale map of the U.S. dotted with timelines, hotspots, and murderous crimson trajectories plastered across the wall behind his desk. They survive by moving around. They don't have the same need for close relationships that normal people do, so they live in an orbit of perpetual drift, in which the chances of running into their victims again is minimized. But they can also turn on the charm, which in the short or medium term at least allows them to stay in one place for a sufficient length of time to allay suspicion and cultivate victims. This extraordinary charisma, and it borders in some cases on the supernatural, even though you know they're cold as ice and would kill you as soon as look at you, you sometimes just can't help liking them, acts as a kind of psychological smokescreen that masks their true intentions. This, by the way, is also why you generally tend to find a higher proportion of psychopaths in urban as opposed to rural areas. In a city, anonymity is easy to come by, but you just try melting into the crowd in a farming or a mining community. You're going to have a hard job. Unfortunately, the words psychopath and drifter go together hand in glove, and that's a huge headache for law enforcement agencies. That right there is what makes our job so goddamn difficult at times. The Lesson of the Moth. Peter Jonassen, the purveyor of James Bond psychology, has a theory about psychopathy. Exploiting others is a highly risky business, he points out, which often results in failure. Not only are people on the lookout for cutthroats and shysters, they are also inclined to react badly to them, legally or otherwise. If you're going to cheat, Jonassen elucidates, being extroverted, charming, and high in self-esteem make it easier to cope with rejection and easier to hit the road. Bond, of course, was always on the road. As a spy, it comes with the territory, same as it does for the serial killer out on the interstate, same as it did for the wandering monks of old. But although these three have rather different reasons for their travels and occupy rather different stations on the psychopathic spectrum, they are also guided by a common metaphysical blueprint, the ceaseless quest for novel, heightened experience, be it a fight to the death with a deranged criminal mastermind, the unfathomable, toxic power in taking another's life, or the transcendental purity of eternal peregrination. Such openness to experience is a quality common to both psychopaths and saints, and, if you recall, constitutes an integral component of mindfulness meditation. Yet it is one of quite a number that these two apparent opposites happen to share. Not all psychopathic traits are spiritual traits, and vice versa. But there are some, as we've seen, that undoubtedly overlap, of which openness to experience is perhaps the most fundamental. Hunter S. Thompson would certainly agree, and it is, after all, the only one we're born with. After wrapping things up with the FBI in Quantico, I head on down to Florida for a holiday. Killing some time in downtown Miami before catching my flight home, I chance on a cloudless Sunday morning in the calles of Little Havana upon a flea market. On a table of bric-a-brac, by the side of a stack of jigsaw puzzles, is a copy of Archie and Mehitabel, its midnight blue dust jacket sandblasted a tropical turquoise by the sun and salt of the ocean. The book, originally penned in 1927 by the celebrated New York columnist Don Marquis, chronicles the verse of its unlikely title character, Archie, a cockroach auteur with a peculiar penchant for poetry, and his oddball adventures with his best pal Mehitabel, a reincarnated alley cat who claims in a previous life to have once been Cleopatra. I thumb through the pages and cough up a couple of dollars. It'll do for the plane, I think. Later that night, 40,000 feet over the slumbering North Atlantic, I come across the following poem. It's a poem about moths, but it's also a poem about psychopaths. I get it copied and stick it in a frame. And now it glowers redoubtably above my desk, an entomological keepsake of the horizons of existence and the brutal, star-crossed wisdom of those who seek them out. I was talking to a moth the other evening. He was trying to break into an electric light bulb and fry himself on the wires. "Why do you fellows pull this stunt?" I asked him. "Because it is the conventional thing for moths, or why? If that had been an uncovered candle instead of an electric light bulb, you would now be a small, unsightly cinder. Have you no sense?" "Plenty of it," he answered, "but at times we get tired of using it. We get bored with routine and crave beauty and excitement. Fire is beautiful, and we know that if we get too close it will kill us, but what does that matter? It is better to be happy for a moment and be burned up with beauty than to live a long time and be bored all the while. So we wad all our life up into one little roll, and then we shoot the roll that is what life is for. It is better to be a part of beauty for one instant and then cease to exist than to exist forever and never be a part of beauty. Our attitude toward life is come easy, go easy. We are like human beings used to be before they became too civilized to enjoy themselves. And before I could argue him out of his philosophy, he went and immolated himself on a patent cigar lighter. I do not agree with him myself. I would rather have half the happiness and twice the longevity. But at the same time, I wish there was something I wanted as badly as he wanted to fry himself.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade. In for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information. We are all done with Mr. Kevin Dutton's The Wisdom of Psychopaths. All done. I think I stated before that we didn't even have an hour of audio. So this is one, if you have thoughts on, we just heard Chapter 7. If you have thoughts on what we just heard, or just overall thoughts on the text, even though we had the big break in between, courtesy of the flood. If you have overall thoughts, concluding analysis of the book, kind of your takeaway opinions, feel free. The number to dial 641-715-3640 and the code 564-943#. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. The number again, 641-715-3640. The code 564-943#. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. If you do not want to use your phone, but you do want to chime in, you can use the free VOPE line. The VOPE line, it's linked at Black Talk Radio Network. If you need the address, it is tinyty.cc/1race. That is the number 1. Address again, tinyty.cc/.1race. No dots, sorry. tiny.cc/1race. There we go. And that is the number 1. When you put in the address, look on the left side, you'll see the link. It says free VOPE line. Click that link. It will open a small window on your screen. The top line, it is a drop-down menu. Select the number that I just gave out, which again is 641-715-3640. Next line, it will ask for the code. That code again is 564-943. Final line, it will ask for a name. You can put in a nickname, real name. You can press random keys. Whatever you're comfortable with. Once you get all that entered, click the green button at the bottom and it will connect you to the live broadcast. You should be able to hear us. Same procedure. If you want to participate, you'll see the dial pad on your screen. Press star 61 and you'll be able to join the conversation. Again, that is all the audio we have. So this is it. Folks can take their opportunity to share final thoughts, if you have any, on what we heard from Mr. Dutton's The Wisdom of Psychopaths. We are all done with the text. Retired firefighter, if you have commentary, feel free. You should be with us. I'll be on the lookout for other hands as well. Retired, were you just listening, retired firefighter, or did you have commentary, sir?
I'm actually at the grocery store and can't talk right now.
Oh, okay. No problem. We will check back in, see if he has a thought in a moment. Any of the other folks, *61. I'll go ahead and get my thoughts while other folks get their concluding analysis together. These are just the notes that I took from Chapter 7 today. Super Sanity, the chapter that we finished up today. Let's see. First up, this is from last week. We did do a little bit of Chapter 7 last week. That was what confused me. Okay. From this week in Chapter 7, the portion where he talks about this study that was conducted, and it was to give 3 different incidents, right, where people needed help. One was, I think the person would just ask for help with directions. One where I think they specified a female dropped some papers, and they had another one where it was a person had like a broken arm or something, and they were struggling to put a cap on water or something. And they said what was most surprising was that the psychopaths were way more helpful than the non-psychopaths for that third group, the group where the person wasn't asking for help. They were pretending to have like a broken arm and were struggling to put a cap on a bottle. That was most surprising, that psychopaths were really, really helpful there. And the way that they explained it, I'll read what he says. One interpretation, of course, is that as some enlightened and no doubt rather embittered soul once pointed out, there is no such thing as truly altruistic act. There is always, however, well camouflaged in the darker recesses of our dense psychological undergrowth, an ulterior self-serving, distinctly less honorable motive, and the psychopaths in Mammoth's study, with their finely tuned, highly sensitive, long-range vulnerability antenna, recall the experiment conducted by Angela Book, in which psychopaths were better able than non-psychopaths to pick out the victims of a violent assault merely from the way they walked, quite simply smelled blood. I think that right there, when I talk about this book, I think when Dr. Rasayon recommended this book years ago, saying that you can learn a lot about what it means to be classified as white, that's the sort of thing that I point to right there, where race soldiers, they can even be very helpful. They can be nice in a variety of different situations. They can be nice. That doesn't mean that they are not racist. If anything, it can mean that they have a long-range plan for how you will be used to practice white supremacy, racism. I thought that was a really important, probably one of the more important portions of the text. Continuing. I thought also when he talked about learning ways to stand up to tough situations and conflict, he said not just to physical confrontation, but also to psychological confrontations, depending on circumstances, can pose just as much of a challenge. I thought that was really important in the system of white supremacy. I think a lot of the times we are mistreated and confronted, not so much in a physically violent manner, but it's still violence. It's just not in a physical form. And I think that's important for us to develop those same types of strategies so that we can stand up. Let's see. He's just continuing from that paragraph. He says, the decision to act heroically is a choice that many of us will be called upon to make at some point in our lives. Zimbardo tells me it means not being afraid of what others might think. It means not being afraid of the fallout for ourselves. It means not being afraid of putting our necks on the line. The question is, are we going to make that decision? I personally, when I read that, even though this guy did the Stanford prison experiment and all that. We talked about that before. I think Emmy mentioned that. I just thought that portion was important with regards to counter racism. I think that's important. I think not being concerned about what other people think. It might just be you, united, independent. I think Mr. Fuller stresses that, and just being focused about if something needs to be done. I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to be fearful with regards to allowing fear stop me from standing up and doing something that I know needs to be done. I think that's important, and that's a decision that we all have to make. Continuing, I thought, let's see. He says he interviewed Zimbardo. He just said he was able to interview this famous guy who's done this famous studies, really. And then he says that he hopped on a plane. Mr. Kevin Dutton is a citizen of Europe. He's in the UK. He hops on a plane, comes to Virginia to interview an FBI agent. Now, I even stopped on that like, wow, this guy is not even a United States citizen. I mean, they're talking about putting up a wall, and we got all these foreigners coming in here left and right, and this guy is not even a U.S. citizen, and he gets an interview with a pretty high-ranking FBI agent to talk about his book and his research on, I mean, I talked about this last week, like just globe-trotting to study white killers. I mean, it is the system of white supremacy. Let's see, next. I thought the portion about how psychopaths, serial killers feel their victims' pain, and in fact they feel it and derive pleasure from it, reminded me so much immediately. My mind went exactly to racist jokes. I don't think when we talk about racist man, racist woman, racist child not empathizing with black people, I think what it could be is exactly the way it was written out here, is that they see black suffering, black pain in all of its forms. They see that and enjoy it. I've talked about racist jokes for years. When he says that psychopaths, they feel it, talking about the pain of their victims, they feel it cognitively and objectively, and they feel it emotionally and subjectively too. But the difference between them and us is that they commute that pain to their own subjective pleasure. In fact, it would probably be true to say that the greater the amount of empathy they have, the greater the amount of pleasure that they get, which, when you think about it, is kind of weird. I think that is racist man, racist woman, racist child. It's not that they don't empathize. It's that they see the suffering of black people, and that is joy. That is pleasure. That's why the proliferation of racist jokes, in my opinion, thousands of them, more than you could ever count. Why we have so many white guests come on this program. Oh, yeah, I've heard, 20, 50, 10,000 of those in my life, depending on how old they are. Let's see. I thought it was also really important where he said, according to Heilbrun's taxonomy, comprised high-Q psychopaths with a history of extreme violence, that they exhibited the most empathy of all. I thought that was really important. The most empathy of all was exhibited by the group comprised of high IQ psychopaths with a history of extreme violence, and then in particular rape, an act that occasionally incorporates a vicarious sadistic component. With all of the Me Too and everything that's going on right now, when I read this, certainly Daniel Holtzclaw, certainly the history of white male rapists, undeniable. I thought immediately of Delectable Negro. I thought of castration, because he talked in a different section in Chapter 7 that we heard today about the trophy killings and taking an article of clothing or something. In many instances, when there was a lynching killing of a black person, it was taking sex organs of a black male. But I thought Delectable Negro and the number of raped black males, because that's something that doesn't get discussed, raped black children, male and females, that does not get discussed. That was also in Delectable Negro. That's what I thought of immediately, in addition to all of the Thomas Jefferson's and Daniel Holtzclaw activity, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, we was mentioned earlier this week, all of that as well. But the other aspects of rape that get left out of consistent white sadistic behavior. Let's see. Halbrun, I'm just reading this portion that all of this is in the same paragraph. Halbrun pointed out, echoing Beasley's earlier observation, it is, in addition, precisely through the presence of empathy and the perpetrator's awareness of the pain being experienced by his victim that preliminary arousal and the subsequent satisfaction of sadistic objectives are achieved. Sadistic objectives are achieved by experiencing, acknowledging, enjoying the pain and suffering of the victim. I think that is whites collectively. And even I thought it was even important because the paragraph that I just read, the very next sentence, new paragraph, not all psychopaths, it would seem, are colorblind. That's consistent shtick that gets pulled into a lot of the talk on racism, white supremacy by many whites. Let's see. I will stop there. I had one or two other points, but I'll leave it at that. Let's see. Mr. Demry, see you had a hand up. If you had commentary that you wanted to get in, final thoughts, feel free. Line should be open.
Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, Gus. Good to hear you back on the radio again. I was worried there for a while. I didn't know what was going on. I got the update, I guess, about the time others did. But good to hear you're back in action, and I hope that my little contribution helped you out in some way. But I'll start with the 7 deadly wins. The way it kind of sums everything up. It's like 7 core principles of psychopathy that apportioned judiciously and applied with due care and attention can help us get exactly what we want, can help us respond rather than react to the challenges of modern day living, and can transform our outlook from victim to victor, but without turning us into villains. You know, I think that you know, that just comes off as like a bunch of crap, you know, but some of these things do have a little value. That they're good positive words, I guess: charm and focus, mental toughness, ruthlessness, fearlessness, mindfulness, and then action. And then if you think about that, guys like Bernie Madoff had all those attributes, you know, stole, you know, billions of dollars from investors. So, you know, it's not all that it's made up to do. I think he took a lot of facts and to back up his premises. And also the book leans towards racism, because I've noticed that he mentioned either Darwinism or Darwinists, you know, at least 9 times in there. And we all know that that theory of evolution and species by natural selection is at the core of this racist ideology and the system of white supremacy. So it's mentioned several times in the book, and that same ideology has been responsible for genocide of millions of black and non-white people, and continue to rear its head and mistreat us on a daily basis today. Whites believing in that type is commonly opposed to creationism. And they always put them together like it's either one or the other. You know, I don't subscribe to either one, but, you know, I kind of lean the way that Mr. Fuller does, kind of poly-religious or whatever. You know, combination of all types to get one idea, because there's no one way, I don't think. And like you said earlier, the test, the three different, whether or not the psychopaths would help people directly or whether they request it, reminds me of blacks and non-white people. We're helping white people. Whether it's request or non-request, that response is a negative response because we seem to be offering our help to whites. And I know you said, Constantly, we should not be out there helping white people. It's just not counter-racist theory. That part about the Stanford experiment where the students were divided into guards and prisoners, and then the guards started misusing their power, and then he used Pearl Harbor, where the whites' false sense of security led to their demise as far as not thinking that the Japanese could possibly attack them. It's that racist ideology of superiority left them vulnerable to attack. He started to talk about whether or not psychopaths had empathy, and he was sort of convincing. And then, if you look at the footnote, he's talking about Henry Lee Lucas, the prolific killer. He killed 246 victims. These types of traits and affecting people in this way, whether they are sadistic or whether they feel any empathy or not, they're monsters. And I don't see how, if you spent millions of dollars and we've locked these guys up, studied them, and this is all we can come up with, is whether or not they feel empathy or not when they kill their victims. I have not been for the death penalty because there's so many black males on death row right now, probably for crimes that they did not commit. So I couldn't, be for the death penalty. But some of these serial killers and the way they do the mass killing, I don't think that they should be taken in alive. I think that it should be some, other types of provisions taken in that case. Describing, comparing the Tibetan Buddhist monks with serial killers, I think that's an act of racism too. I mean, I got something out of the reading on mindfulness. I think I investigated a little of that, did a little meditation or whatever. I think that's constructive. But comparing 2,000-year-old belief system with these serial killers, and they said that there's 35 to 50 serial killers operating in the United States at any one time. It's probably more than that. And the feeling of the whole book, just lets me know that psychopaths are not just serial killers. People we work with, people you see every day, and most of the characteristics that he's covered, you can see it in almost every white person. So I think I'll mute my line on that. Glad to have you back, Gus. Thanks for taking the call.
Indeed, Mr. Demry-Four. Good to hear from you. Thank you for supporting the program and your verbal participation. Always appreciated down through the years. Good to have you back with us as well. And I definitely agree with that point about the comparison. Talk about metaphors. Mention that compensatory call-in is tomorrow evening, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. I talk about metaphors every Saturday broadcast, and I completely agree with Mr. Demry-Four about rejecting that comparison between this spiritual practice and meditation and being able to control your body and responses, comparing that to white killers and psychopaths. I totally reject that. It's totally, I mean, that's just as bogus can be. We're just talking about trying to say, oh, it does, relate because psychopaths, they have the same sort of ability to turn off their emotions and not respond. Come on. That's ridiculous. And at least in my opinion, it fits the same pattern throughout the text of both minimizing white violence and the violence and mistreating that psychopaths carry out, white psychopaths carry out, and then putting that on the plane with something that is spiritual, that is not about mistreating people. That's supposed to be about, people trying to be the best that they can be in a constructive manner, and even, helping you to relate to others in a constructive manner. I totally reject that as well. Let's see. Double check to see if anybody. Again, we do not have another audio segment. There is no more reading in the text. So if folks have concluding thought that they want to make sure they get in, certainly wanted to make sure that I also got in the portion about World War II. I think I agree with Mr. Demry-Four exactly on that as well. I think that's one where I would say Mr. Dutton, I think practicing racism, white supremacy did not just say, hey, that could be racism, white supremacy, or white supremacist narcissism to say these little slant eyes, these little Japs, there's no way that they can, do anything against the mighty United States military might. That, I think, was some of the sentiment at the time as well. I know Mr. Fuller has talked about an article that was in True magazine that talked about how you could not be an A1 crackerjack pilot if you were Asian because you had little slanty eyes and there's just no way you could be a great pilot. He said that was printed in True magazine. He saw that in his lifetime, that was widespread opinion during the time of World War II, 1930s, 1940s. The caller at 0747, did you have commentary?
Greetings, Gus, and welcome back. I found the book interesting in a couple points. One, talking about a very disturbing topic, and there's a lot of humor, and I don't know, I thought that was interesting. It was always like he was making jokes about a topic that is pretty disturbing, to me at least. The second thing is that he talks a lot about surgery, and I've had the opportunity to observe a lot of surgeons over the years. He surmised that a lot of the psychopathic behavior is adaptive for surgery or benefit, and I completely reject that personally, just from my personal observation. I also took your recommendation of looking at Dr. Bobby Wright's book as a complementary text. And one thing he talked about was that you can't use moral persuasion with the psychopath. And I thought that was very central, that there's no negotiation with a psychopathic person. Lastly, it helped me to kind of understand when you look at postcards of groups of white and lynching, and they're all smiling and children are happy. It's almost like it's a picnic. It kind of gives you
the book gave me kind of a perspective to kind of understand. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Appreciate that. I'm so glad at least one listener was able to check out Dr. Bobby E. Wright's Psychopathic Racial Personality and other essays, the phenomenal work of the late Dr. Bobby E. Wright. I think he was mentioned on the program earlier this month. Outstanding reading material and definitely related. Like, wow, that book is so short. I think it's less than 100 pages. If you participated in the study sessions or if you listen to the archives or what have you for this text, you could read that book in one day. It's that short and it's phenomenal. It's just outstanding information. I wish he had more years to give us more scholarship, but great information, and I think it is a great text to pair with this one if you haven't already read it. If you have read it before, it's short enough that you can make a quick revisit to, I'm sure, get some pieces of wisdom. We have any other folks who had come? Again, there is nothing left to read. We are all done, so if you do not have commentary, we will call it a wrap for Mr. Dutton. The caller, I think this is Mel. Is this Mel? Did you have commentary, ma'am?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I missed this last section. I was stuck in traffic and it was kind of difficult to reach my phone. So I did miss the actual last, hour of reading. So the comments I'm going to make are pretty much about my overall impressions of the book so far. And if it's already been said, I'm sorry for being repetitive. I'm pretty sure it's already been said that he basically minimized, Dutton just seemed to overall just minimize the damages of psychopaths throughout the book. Just in the title itself, I guess you could kind of predict that, if he was going to glamorize them, I guess you could predict that was going to be the case, but it was interesting to see it all the way through. I think that it was interesting how throughout the book, different professions keep getting brought up, so doctors and lawyers and stock market traders, and I don't remember hunters. I know soldiers was brought up, and I'm kind of reminded that he kept talking about professions and not so much people, unless they were killers, and I think being a killer is also a profession. But I know we've said before that there was no link pretty much between race and psychopathy. And that makes me think, I guess, of the Parkland shooter in Florida that just recently occurred, that shooting. And it makes me think that, that I think someone in the future is going to glamorize the Parkland shooter, or that there's going to be something like, I don't know, Columbine fashion or something. I feel like white supremacists have a history of glamorizing psychopaths and killers. I'm thinking of, Billy the Kid and Alexander the Great. At the time when Charles Manson was doing what he did, it probably was taboo to sort of talk about him and go into his life story and empathize with him. But given enough time, they become icons, I guess like Ben Tillman and other psychopaths. And I did want to say I agreed with Mr. Demery Ford that I think the link with the, I believe the Tibetan Buddhist meditation, that link to psychopathy in this book and all his links to Eastern religions, I guess, Eastern Asian religions has been, I also suspect it was an act of racism, just outright. That was all I had so far. I could have, that was all I had so far. This has been an interesting read.
Indeed it has, Mel. Indeed it has. And we, again, for listeners, are all done. All done. No book left. If you missed the first portion of the audio, well, you'll just have us chatting because there's no book left to read. All done. We were pretty close last week. We only had about 40 minutes of audio this week. But I agree. I think the points, some of the important points that Mel raised about minimizing of the behavior, racist behavior, about glorifying Mr. Cruz, the alleged white killer down in Florida, 17 people killed. I think that if if the glamorizing him has not already started, it's probably going to happen pretty quickly. And I know with Charles Manson, it happened immediately. That case, even though I wasn't alive at the time, that case, unless I've been misinformed, became one of the first media crazes. He was a celebrity instantaneously, that. People were following that. That was I guess it's not Saturday, so the metaphor, that was like the O.J. Simpson case. People were following that every day and updates and what's going on with the case. And I think they had movies and such about him pretty early on. His celebrity status was pretty immediate, unless I've been misinformed. The appeal of the white killer, I think the same thing happened with Dylan Roof, where he got celebrity status pretty quick. I think he's like a cult hero amongst many white supremacists around the world. Same thing with Anders Breivik. Started with him at the beginning of the program. Any other comments folks want to make sure they get in? Again, we have no more audio, so final thoughts. Folks want to make sure they get in. Do not dally, because there is no more book to read.
Can I make, I guess, a point that what you just said, it reminds me of something?
Let's hear it.
So when you put it like that, it kind of makes me think that this whole book is less of a research study or a research, kind of accumulation of studies, I suppose, and more of like a manual. I guess it sort of reads more like that, like these are what psychopaths do, aspire to this. It kind of points out a whole bunch. It's like almost a textbook of psychopaths, and textbooks are meant to be learned from. It kind of makes me think of the book in that sort of light, actually.
Brilliant observation. I think a lot of us have said throughout this text, even some of the folks that were with us before the flood break, that it seems more like this book was kind of glorifying some of these white killers that were being mentioned. Charles Manson was mentioned in the early part of this text, along with some of the other killers who felt like they were being glorified. And so that would make total sense. The glorification of their being so ruthless and them being so cool in the face of pressure, and they're not bothered by things, like glorifying these attributes, and so even comparing them in some sort of saintly spiritual manner towards the end of the book. It makes total sense. Any other comments folks want to? Again, there's nothing left to read, so if there is no commentary, then we will call it a session, because we have no book left to read. Any other comments? Not that big of a book. I was reminded of that when I went back to look, wow, we were almost at the finish line prior to the flood. If we had been able to hold on, we could have finished and had a clean break. But yeah, that is the duration of The Wisdom of Psychopaths, Mr. Kevin Dutton. I wish we did not have the break, but for people who are listening to the archives, there will be no break. You can just listen seamlessly from the first episode, and it's only 6 of them. It's not even that many. Go easily from 1 to 6, and you'll be able to enjoy and study the text, and I think you'll be able to get quite a bit without that interruption. You can read and study. Check out Dr. Bobby E. Wright, Psychopathic Racial Personality and Other Essays. Phenomenal text, phenomenal scholarship. I'm sure Dr. Welsing had that in her library. Read that great companion text to this book. And again, massive kudos to Dr. Niyana Rasayon, eyesofmaat.com. He's been a guest on the program many, many, many times. He is the person who recommended this book repeatedly, said that we should check this book out. Excellent recommendation. Reading is more important than watching television, reading and writing. Last word, any final thoughts? Soon folks are satisfied. We will be here tomorrow, normal time, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, for the compensatory call-in. We'll review what has gone down over the past 7 days, and hopefully have not be dominated by Black Panther conversation. With that, hopefully folks will enjoy their Friday, wrapping the session up early, but finish the book. Oh, well. You can be constructive with your extra time this Friday evening. I will again encourage sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy. With white psychopaths running amok, you certainly want to make sure that you are able to think clearly as you are out and about. That was one other thing. That segment where he was talking about roadkill and all of these homicides at roadside stops and what have you, I rejected the implication that psychopaths are just kind of grifter people, that they're not truckers and that sort of thing. You got many, he mentioned Hannibal Lecter in the book. You got many of these white psychopaths who are putting on a suit, Bernie Madoff and what have you, who are putting on a suit and tie and going out and functioning very well and terrorizing black people on a daily basis. That is how many whites function. They're not grifters and homeless people with one tooth. That's in the same vein, the way that they try to suggest that racists are just Klan members and what have you. Like, it's far more sophisticated. I think he pointed that out to some degree in the text, but just wanted to make sure I got that in as well. Anywho, sobriety would be best regardless under conditions of white supremacy. If you're going to be out and about this weekend, Black History Month, if that means anything, you certainly want to have full functioning brain computers to make excellent decisions as you are out and about. Never know when you might bump into a Daniel Holtzclaw, where your life might depend on phenomenal decisions. I don't think being under the influence will help that. That said, Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cow signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.